One challenge that comes with running a channel that only covers one major topic per week is that, especially in 2025, far more than one thing tends to happen every week. So today, in a special Q&A episode, we're going to try and cover much wider ground. For months, I've been collecting questions from the patrons and wider YouTube audience on everything from the effectiveness of certain weapon systems in Ukraine, to the evolution of Europe's defence industry, to corruption, Russian nuclear weapons, to one of history's worst examples of military logistics and planning. And so today I'm going to take a shot at some of the questions that you in the audience apparently want answered. Now, I'm not going to be able to get through every question that was asked, but in order to get through as many as possible, I've collapsed them into a couple of categories. First, we're going to talk about the war in Ukraine and associated topics, then broaden things out to the wider world and defence economics topics as a whole, and then finally some stuff that's a little less serious and more inwards focused. Questions about the channel, how it works, how I run it, and some fun miscellaneous stuff like gaming, and a surprising number of questions relating to the prospect of unarmed combat between or with flightless birds. Keep in mind that since this is a Q&A episode, we won't be going into anywhere near as much depth as we normally would, and I obviously won't have done the same sort of research I would for a standard episode. In the end, my goal is for this to be fun, a little bit different, and to cover a lot of ground quickly. But before we get into defence economics or the combat power of your average emu, a quick word from a sponsor. If you regularly track major international developments, it's probably not news to you that coverage of them can occasionally be complex, contested, and politically charged. And that can make it all the harder when you see a report to know if you're getting the story from all the angles. If we flick through headlines covering the PRC's response to recently imposed US tariffs, for example, you'll see a lot of headlines mentioning retaliatory tariffs, but others also link Chinese antitrust investigations into US companies like Google to the broader issues of tariffs and trade tensions. The tool being used to quickly flick between these stories here is long-term channel sponsor Ground News. By reportedly drawing on more than 50,000 sources around the world, it can enable you to quickly compare how a given story is being covered, while also giving you potentially valuable context for the coverage you're seeing. That includes things like ownership information for media sources, as well as a factuality rating based on the work of 3 independent news monitoring organisations. Plus, it offers a number of other tools that I've come to appreciate, like the blind spot feed. What this can allow you to do is essentially surface stories that might not be receiving a lot of coverage in sources you tend to consume. And so if you're trying to get a better understanding of what different parts of the internet might be reading, reporting, or discussing, this is the kind of tool that might help you do it. And so for those of you interested in a tool like this, I'll leave a link in the description. That'll give you access to a 40% discount on their Vantage plan, which is the one I've been using for some time now. And so with my great thanks to Ground News for their support, let's get back to it. Okay, so as you might expect, given the subject matter of the channel, a lot of the questions I got related to the war in Ukraine. And the first one had to do with the usefulness of a specific piece of equipment, the so-called Dragon drone. For those of you who aren't aware, Dragon drone is basically a colloquial term to refer to a basic quad-rotor bomber drone that instead of dropping high-explosive projectiles, instead uses a thermite payload. I'll show a YouTube-friendly version of the visual effect on the right there, which is basically a small object spraying a lot of very hot material over a target area for a comparatively short duration. The Ukrainians appear to have been the first to use this system and have used it on a larger scale, but we've also seen some Russian employment as well. When you have very limited information, especially when it comes to a new weapon appearing for the first time, there's a couple of factors you can look at. The basic technical characteristics that suggest how useful it should be, anecdotes from the battlefield, any hard evidence or statistics of battlefield performance that you can pull together, and also things like budgetary clues. Assuming that if a system is particularly successful, the inventors are probably going to try and scale up the usage of it. Bringing all that together in this case, I'd say this is very much not a straight upgrade of your conventional bomber drone, it's more like a specialised side grade. The drone has to be much lower to the ground than if it was dropping ammunition from higher up, and against certain targets you might prefer a high explosive, anti-tank or thermobaric munition. But it clearly has some advantages. You might be able to set cover on fire, for example, if troops are dug into a tree line. The morale effect might be significant because, fire raining from the sky does tend to be a significant emotional event for people who witness it up close. And I also think another important factor is just availability. Ukraine has an enormous demand for munitions that can be deployed on drones. Thermite payloads are available, so they got used. For the moment, I think we can assess them as a useful, innovative way to use the resources Ukraine has available to it, but I don't really see them as a game changer in the sense that other countries will be rushing to mass produce them. A much more impactful change to small drones in Ukraine, I'd argue, is the greater and greater use of fibre optic drones and other jam-resistant systems. We've discussed these before. They're essentially FPVs that instead of relying on a radio signal that might be jammed, instead spool out a very, sometimes very long fibre optic cable so the operator can control the system in true 20th century fashion. When these drones first started to appear, I remember warning against writing them off despite the obvious disadvantages of using the cable, because there are huge motives for both Russia and Ukraine to use them. The basic reason is very simple. The primary defense that both the Russians and Ukrainians had against FPVs and small drones was electronic warfare. And we have report after report after report that said, especially in the early years of the war, the overwhelming majority of drones that both Russia and Ukraine were losing were to friendly or opposing EW. A cable doesn't give two shits about any of that. You can pump out so much jamming that the local EM spectrum looks like a Slanesh-sponsored disco. It doesn't matter. And this is part of why I believe a lot of forces, when they're looking at their future CUAS, so counter-UAS requirements, there's already, I think, some acknowledgement that you can't rely entirely on soft kill methods. Anti-drone jamming guns or larger EW installations. You're going to need hard kill options as well that actually knock the drones down, whether that be lasers, high-powered microwaves, active protection systems, autocannons, interceptor drones, or even just Damo on watch with a shotgun. FPVs have been a major factor in the war in Ukraine for years, but their relative effectiveness has waxed and waned over time. And right now I'd suggest their overall battlefield effect is either the most or close to the most that it has ever been. There are places in Ukraine where there are so many fibre optic cables draped over trees after drones are being used, they kind of look like eerie spider webs. Proof of the widespread use of quite an old technology. Remember, wire-guided ATGMs have been around for a long time, but the combination of that very simple concept and technology with a very affordable precision weapon, the FPV drone, has created the kind of tactical problem that I'm not convinced a lot of militaries around the world are prepared to face en masse. Then zooming out a bit more, we had a lot of questions relating to the potential implications if the USA withdraws its support from Ukraine or disengages from NATO, and it's basically left as a task for Europe and Ukraine alone. I'll start with the first version of the question, which is what happens to supplies to Ukraine if the US decides to cut them off? And I think the answer really comes down to, what do you mean by cut them off? Because there's basically a sliding scale here, running from the USA does deliver the things that have been pledged but haven't yet been delivered, to the USA continues to deliver supplies but now requires someone to pay for it, whether that be the Europeans or the Ukrainians by handing over some of their resource reserves. Or finally, America just closes the door on US supplies going to Ukraine full stop, basically imposing an arms embargo on Ukraine and an indirect embargo on transfers on its allies to the benefit of its opponent Russia. If you're looking at the first scenario, Ukraine probably has a couple of months as supplies that were pledged during the closing days of the Biden presidency continue to arrive before you start to see any major gaps or shortages start to emerge. Then if for future deliveries the US says, yep, we'll send stuff, but someone else has to pay for it, it really becomes a political will question. Is someone willing to pay the bill for ongoing US supplies, and if so, how much? Even if the answer to that question is yes, though, I suspect part of the effect would be to slowly transition Ukraine away from some US hardware, at least when there's an alternative available. Because if, for example, a European donor is given the choice between paying for a very expensive American product or an also expensive European product, then I strongly suspect they'd go with the latter option, which means Ukraine would get essential US hardware, so mostly munitions and spares for existing equipment, but anything that could practically be replaced probably would eventually be replaced. And you'd start to see US firms and US systems have a bit less market share in the Ukrainian inventory. A recent US DoD report, for example, I think valued small Switchblade 300 loitering munitions being sent to Ukraine at almost $80,000 and the larger tank killers, the Switchblade 600s, at something like $200,000 per unit. That's extremely exquisite pricing, given Switchblade 300 targets tend to be infantry, so potential FPV targets, and it's generally understood there are anti-armor loitering munitions being used in Ukraine that would cost a fraction of that $200K price point. They may not be as good, but they are much, much cheaper. And so the only way I'd expect to see very large shipments of these systems continued if it's because the US is putting up the money and deciding to send the American product. If it's German money, they're probably going to buy something from Helsing or a Ukrainian firm instead. If you're looking at a complete arms embargo situation, though, things get tougher for Ukraine, especially over the medium term, because there is a number of systems that rely on parts or munitions that realistically only America can provide or only America can sign off on. Eventually, for example, HIMARS and M270 units are going to have to severely pull back on their ammunition use, Patriot batteries will eventually run out of interceptors, and it would probably eventually make life difficult for the F-16 fleets as well, although there are a lot of spare parts spread around various users. So I think that scenario where the US cuts Ukraine off entirely, even when someone comes up with the money, would be very painful for the Ukrainians, but I think that would be a pretty extraordinary step, and taken as such in international and diplomatic circles, given that it would actively cost the US arms industry and US jobs by cutting them off from potential exports, pretty much just to benefit Russia. That said, it is 2025, an eventful year already, so I wouldn't rule anything out. The extension question was, Can Europe hypothetically handle itself if the US does decide to pull back from a security perspective? And I don't want to dive too far into this one for two reasons. One, because I do want to do a specific video on the topic, and two, because I don't think we're quite there yet. There's still a difference, I think, between the US saying they don't want to be the primary security sponsor for Europe or European security projects, and the United States deciding to leave NATO entirely and not participate if Europe is attacked. So far, at least, it sounds more like a proposal for intense burden shifting than it does for an actual withdrawal. That said, if I had to give a TLDR answer right now, noting that US policy certainly seems to be dynamic at this point. Can Europe handle itself against Russia without the United States present? Depending on your assumptions, I think the answer is probably yes. But going forward, it does mean things changing from a European security policy perspective compared to the way they've been. It's a bit rough to expect that you could confront a non-peaceful situation on peace dividend settings. Okay, so moving back to some questions about Russia in relation to the war, starting with the Black Sea. And the question basically asks, why hasn't Russia stopped Ukraine exporting grain along its new grain corridor? One would expect every Ukrainian cargo ship in the Black Sea to be a potential Russian target, so how is it that, minus some exceptions, Ukraine does manage to export this way? And it is managing to export a lot of grain this way. Ukraine has managed to do a pretty comparable job exporting its product after the end of the grain deal than it did during it. And it obviously no longer has to give Russia the control or access it enjoyed under that deal. I did do a video on this, which I'll link in the description, but the broad answer is probably just a combination of deterrence and denial. Denial in a sense that if the Russians were to send out warships or helicopters to try and board these civilian transports, which is probably what you'd want to do, rather than just sinking civilian traffic with long-range missiles from over the horizon, then they run the very real risk of Droney McDroneface sailing up and putting a hole in the side of their very expensive surface combatant, or some bloke with a missile truck blapping them from over the horizon. And so far, we haven't really seen evidence that the Russians have a good answer to those kind of threats. Helicopters were being used as a countermeasure to naval drones for a long period of time, but now that some of these drones can shoot back using adapted air-to-air missiles or heavy machine guns, and we have seen them take down some Russian helicopters, even that tactic is dangerous as well. So it makes sense for the Russians, who, frankly speaking, don't have an enormous number of naval assets in the Black Sea, to just back off and let the Ukrainians trade. The other aspect is deterrence, which is basically that if Russia were to decide to just start sinking these merchant ships using long-range anti-ship missiles, for example, Ukraine could direct its naval warfare assets, specifically those long-range drones, against civilian ships supplying Russian ports, and then presumably minimise the diplomatic fallout by saying, hey, we are just retaliating here and we will stop the moment the Russians agree to as well. And so thus far we have seen the Russians poke this maritime line a couple of times, but presumably for some combination of those reasons, never really escalate it in a sustained way. The big picture takeaway, I think, is that if you look at the objectives both sides probably had in the area, I'd be relatively comfortable saying that, so far at least, the battle for the Black Sea is one that Ukraine is winning. It's probably their best front overall this war, and the one where they've most overperformed their available resources. Because they've been able to take some satellite internet terminals, some home-built hulls, off-the-shelf engines and other components, a bunch of high explosives, glue it all together with a lot of ingenuity and a little bit of crazy, and use it to essentially fight off what was meant to be the most powerful naval force in the Black Sea. There were a couple of questions on nuclear use, with this one being fairly representative. Do you believe there are those in the Russian military that understand that using nukes would likely make the situation worse? And are there those in the command structure that would disobey and halt a Putin-ordered strike? Now, ideally this would be an intelligence-led question where you actually knew what these people were saying to each other and what thoughts they had expressed. But if you're asking for just a gut feeling, based on what we've seen from the Russian military so far and what we know of their doctrine, my guess at the answers would be that in order, yes, there are those in the Russian military who understand that using nukes is probably counterproductive, being extremely costly in a strategic sense, while probably not being that beneficial in a tactical or operational sense. If their modelling of how you could potentially use non-strategic nuclear weapons beneficially on the battlefield is anything like what we know of the old Soviet models, then to get a noticeable battlefield effect, you wouldn't be planning to use a single nuke, you'd want to be using a shit ton of them. And I'm sure there are officers who didn't sleep through their classes and can rub a neuron or two together in order to figure out that firing off a bunch of nukes in order to potentially break through Ukrainian lines or temporarily drive up Ukrainian losses, for example, maybe destroy an airbase, probably isn't worth setting your global diplomatic position on fire or depleting a nuclear stockpile, which you might suddenly need intact more than ever because you've just broken the nuclear taboo and there are other nuclear-armed states out there. To the second part of the question, though, I strongly suspect that if Russian units receive a properly formatted, valid instruction to launch nuclear weapons from Vladimir Putin, then even if they personally are of the belief that that launch is probably stupid and are horrified by the entire concept, the missiles are probably going to fly. The power of just following orders is a very real thing. There's always room for people to rationalise the action to themselves by saying they don't have access to all the information the higher decision-making authorities might. Or, example, cop-outs, for lack of a better term, like telling themselves that if they don't do it, someone else will. So as pessimistic as it might sound, I don't think any planning option should rely on Russian officers not launching nuclear weapons in order to contain the risk of nuclear escalation. As it is, I think it's deterrence that contains nuclear use, not the conscience of Russian officers. The next question then, presuming that no nuclear fireballs go off, has to do with Russian military reconstruction. Basically, how the Russian military would reconstitute itself, and specifically the viability of this claim we've seen some sources make, that Russia might be able to pose a threat to NATO countries within 3 to 5 years of the war ending. This one's probably going to be a video of its own eventually, because there are a lot of moving parts and assumptions to work through. But personally, I think the challenges of Russian military reconstruction are going to run fairly deep, and unless you presume NATO countries are going to do everything they can to make life easy for the Russians, a Russian attack on NATO itself on those kind of timelines strikes me as a monumentally stupid idea. That, of course, doesn't mean they won't go with the monumentally stupid and risky idea if they perceive weakness, for example. But even just recovering from the war in Ukraine so far, I think, is going to be a pretty tall mountain to climb. Unless, of course, there's a joker in the strategic mix and Russia receives significant foreign support or something. I think the big picture, though, is that even if the threat from a European perspective is a little bit further out in timeline terms, if they want to maximise their deterrent potential against that threat, they really need to start doing it now. The wheels turn slowly in Europe, it takes time to build up industry and capability, and as a very general rule, it's always going to be cheaper to build something in advance than at the last second in a hurry. Okay, and then finally some more general questions on the war in Ukraine and the methodology around it, starting with what's something that's quite difficult to assess as an open source analyst. And here there is a very long list of things, and I think it's very important not to overestimate what open source intelligence can do. But in terms of scale of importance, I think near the top would be the status of the two forces. We can observe and count equipment, we can track the front lines, we can make inferences about the supply situation, and also, as we just did last episode, you can also build some rough estimates around personnel inflows and outflows. What's harder to assess are all the intangibles that go into determining whether troops are going to fight hard or whether they're going to surrender, whether they're going to hold their ground or if they're going to fall back, how they're going to respond if they face a new or unexpected threat type, and what sort of combat power and skills do they actually have. I'm talking about things like morale, fatigue, quality of leadership, mastery of basic military skills. Those things aren't just important to determining how a fight will go, sometimes they're arguably the most important. If you want an illustration of that, just compare the resistance the Ukrainians have put up as compared to the likes of the Afghan National Army. And the problem from an open source perspective is most of the indicators we get access to about those kind of soft factors are usually backward looking. They have to do with how the force has been fighting, not how it might be capable of fighting going forward. And it doesn't help that a lot of the evidence that's out there on these factors tends to be highly anecdotal. So yes, on the whole, very important, but difficult to determine. Next thing has to do with corruption in Ukraine and basically asks, is it a problem and is it as bad as Russia? And I think on the evidence, the answer is yes and no respectively. Corruption, and not just corruption, but also things like inefficient bureaucratic structures are a major problem that Ukraine has had to grapple with, and that goes all the way back to Soviet times. There are very few post-Soviet states or post-Warsaw Pact states more generally that don't deal with at least some legacy of corruption. The Baltic states have mostly transitioned relatively well, albeit unevenly, but it's a fairly short list. You're talking about countries that start out relatively poor with a lot of economic, social and political disruption, which means even in the better cases, moving away from the way things were in the 90s or early 2000s is going to take some effort. If you look at Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, which is one of the ways you can measure corruption across countries using a similar methodology, you'll see evidence of that journey for some current EU members. In 2000, for example, Croatia had a score of 37 out of 100, 0 being bad, 100 being good on the index. And by 2024, that had improved to 47, enough to move the country into roughly the top third least corrupt globally, but still a long, long way from leading European states like Denmark. In 2000, Ukraine's score was absolutely abysmal, as in worse than Russia's, something like 15 points out of 100. But then you start to see significant improvement, and especially after 2014 and the revolution. In the present day, Ukraine's index is now in the mid-30s, I believe, significantly better than Russia's, with Ukraine now being ranked in between Serbia and Brazil, while Russia was assessed to be 1 point more corrupt than Iran, and only 1 point less corrupt than countries like Chad and Zimbabwe. So I think the best answer is it's a significant problem, but not as much of a problem as it is in Russia. There are two quick asterisks to attach to that. The first is the general level of corruption is going to be different to the amount of corruption there is when it comes to things like foreign weapons supplies, for example, because there's a lot more checks and balances and international attention on what happens to foreign funds and foreign weapons than there is to what happens, for example, with Ukrainian funds. There was a recent US report, for example, on defense articles that have been sent to Ukraine, which was subject to what's called enhanced end-use monitoring. We're talking things like javelins, stingers, and switchblades. And one thing that stood out to me is despite the amount of this stuff that had been sent to Ukraine significantly increasing between June 2023 and May 2024, the value of delinquent articles fell by something like 80%, as better inventory and reporting processes were put into place and the system caught up with what was being supplied. So I think the broad characterization there is that when it comes to the supply of these kind of weapon systems to Ukraine, there are controls, monitoring, and reporting systems in place, and those have likely been improving in effectiveness as the war's gone on. And secondly, I think it's historically clear that a country doesn't have to be perfect in order to have a lot of potential and to be well worth saving, so to speak. It's not like South Korea, for example, was a paragon of democracy and transparency at the time the world intervened to stop the North Korean invasion. Going forward, though, I'd actually assess anti-corruption efforts as being one of the more important parts of the overall Ukrainian war effort, not just because it affects how efficiently the economy and the war economy specifically runs, but it also affects the buy-in of society. And so time will tell whether Ukraine is able to maintain that momentum, especially as they try and push towards things like EU membership. Then I was asked, what are some of the lessons that other countries would probably be well served learning from Ukraine? And then on the flip side, what are some lessons they probably shouldn't learn? There are a lot of commentators who've touched on that first topic, so let's just zip through a few, which I think you can kind of split into lessons that are being relearned from previous battlefields and new ones that are being learned for future battlefields. In terms of stuff that's being relearnt, arguably an observation would be that yes, mass is important. Your force needs to be set up to take and regenerate through attrition, and magazine depth absolutely matters. Depending on who you are, a 7, 14, 30 or 90-day stockpile of ammunition for your artillery, for example, may not actually be anywhere close to adequate for your needs. And likewise, I suspect that a number of nations have at least partially learned the lesson that you probably need a lot more missiles in your inventory of just about every kind than has been the general standard over the last couple of decades. I think most of those are relatively uncontroversial, and I'll save the more controversial ones for the next time we talk topics like helicopters. But then I think you have to view those sort of relearning lessons in the context of lessons that are being learnt about the modern battlefield. A lot of this comes down to how technology, like drones and better communication systems, are changing things. The battlefield is much more transparent. Drones have made both ISR assets and precision weapons incredibly cheap, incredibly accessible, and available across all force echelons. I think forces generally have to assume going forward that unless you invest a lot of effort in it, it is going to be more difficult to conceal manoeuvres than ever before. And because of that proliferation in things like affordable ISR drones, FPVs, loitering munitions, and even just modern accurate indirect fires that can be guided by those drones, the likelihood that a well-prepared, intelligent opponent, if not properly suppressed, is going to be able to turn your manoeuvre into a mass casualty event may well become a more common state of affairs on future battlefields, unless and until forces are able to find a way to effectively adapt. My general assessment at the moment is that in that UAS-CUAS space, the sword is still evolving more rapidly than the shield. A lot of the developments have been improving the munitions faster than they've been improving the countermeasures. And so I think militaries might need to be prepared to face a taste of that, even if they're not up against a peer opponent. And then, probably a bit more in my wheelhouse, you can add a couple of observations from a defence economics perspective. I think it's been established that lean inventories, just-in-time manufacturing, that approach to cost minimisation in defence production really doesn't work in any context other than a true peace dividend setting. It is more expensive to overinvest in your production capability, to maintain slack capacity, to build up bigger stockpiles. Those things are more expensive. But I think we've seen that it can be even more expensive to not have what you need when you need it. And the lead time for so many modern military products is now so long, the prospect that you would get into a war and then start producing them really doesn't work. So really there's a whole bunch of thinking that needs to go into how do you generate scale, how do you generate resilience, where do you maintain slack capacity, and how do you better gear up to deter a peer or near-peer opponent? I won't go down that particular rabbit hole today, but suffice to say, I think there's enough material there for an episode or two. And then as far as lessons that shouldn't be learned go, this is probably also a pretty long list, but I think I'd put the general focus on not assuming that every future peer or near-peer conflict is going to look like the one in Ukraine. That doesn't mean dismissing the lessons and pretending that you can ignore what we've seen, but at the same time, there are likely to be differences. I don't think, for example, that you should look at the war in Ukraine and the mutual air denial we've seen and conclude that air forces are probably a waste of money. The current situation owes a lot to the fact that these are two countries that invested very heavily in air defence or inherited a lot of air defence systems from the Soviet Union, while at the same time having air forces that don't really have the equipment or training they need to break down the opposing air defence system. I think it's reasonable to argue that in many other scenarios, the air battle would be less of a sideshow and more of a decisive aspect to the campaign. So suffice to say, if I was running procurement for a major military, I wouldn't be rushing to cancel all my Air Force programs. And to build on that, there were a lot of questions asking basically what you would expect to be different if you had a conflict between NATO countries and the Russian military as opposed to what we see between Russia and Ukraine. For example, this one. After we've witnessed huge equipment and manpower expenditure with very limited territorial gains in Ukraine, do you think it would be any different for Russia if it attacked some neighbouring countries, e.g. the Baltic states or Poland? And I can't really give a blanket description of how every possible campaign would go because it really depends on the context, the political setup, what are the objectives, where are forces, who's committed, who isn't. Are there political constraints in NATO capitals saying don't destroy too many Russian targets in case this whole thing goes nuclear, just hold the line while we work out negotiations? Or is it a situation where the military is given carte blanche to, using conventional weapons only, punt the Russians back where they came from? Another big question would be surprise. In almost any scenario, if you give the attacker the advantage of surprise, you'd expect them to take at least some territory before the defender is able to regroup. But I do think there is a higher level note that we might be able to make with a greater degree of certainty. And that is that I would expect the curve of losses and material expenditure over time to look very different if it was Russia fighting against a collection of NATO countries than what we currently see with Russia fighting Ukraine. What we see in Ukraine at the moment is a relatively stable, protracted, attritional burn rate. Things can obviously escalate during larger operations, but for the most part, there are attacks every day, counterattacks every day, drone strikes every day, and the two forces, with their available material, are just constantly ground against each other. There are arguably a lot of factors that have gone into creating that vaguely World War I style scenario. The technological and tactical advantages enjoyed by defenders, the lethality of modern fires, the proliferation of ISR and precision, but also just capability limitations and exhaustion in both of these forces. Launching small, continuous infantry and mechanised assaults is just a tactically simpler operation than doing stuff at a larger scale in a combined arms fashion. And the number of officers and units in both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries that are realistically capable of carrying out combined arms offensive operations at a larger scale is probably very limited at this point. You also have a degree of mutual air denial, which limits the ability of both sides to support offensive operations using air power the way they might like, and both sides are fairly supply constrained on just about everything. Ukraine is only able to fire ammunition as quickly as it receives it from its allies. Russia is only able to launch missile strikes as it produces new missiles. Russian armoured units have been sustained through multiple offensives by reactivated Soviet equipment, but they can only be reconstituted as fast as that equipment can be dragged out of a storage yard, welded a bit, and fitted with an upgrade package that basically boils down to a drone net and a fresh coat of paint. NATO militaries, by contrast, would be coming into the situation in a very different state. Sure, they may have suffered from underinvestment, but they still have all of their pre-war manpower and reserves available. They have an enormous pool of air assets, the ability to carry out SEAD-DEAD missions against Russian air defense systems, and a lot of standoff munitions. Plus, even if production rates for some equipment and munitions might lag a bit, the stockpiles, such as they are still going to be there. So I think if you wargame that kind of scenario, in a lot of iterations, what you're going to see is not so much a smooth curve of expenditure and casualties spread over an extended period of time, the way we have in Ukraine. Instead, what you're going to see is the board go absolutely apeshit for the first couple of days or weeks, as a lot of those munitions are expended. There's an attempt to achieve air superiority. A lot of these pre-war units, stocked with professionals, are able to take their pre-existing equipment and stockpiles and throw them onto the battlefield in order to try and get as much effect as possible, as rapidly as possible. And the point where things start to slow down is going to be either A, where politics and diplomacy intervene, perhaps after one side acknowledges it's been punched in the face and that they'd now like to talk, or B, when that initial wave of active duty forces has been chewed up and the magazines have started to run empty. It's only at that point, after a flurry of initial punches have been thrown, that I'd expect things to start to settle back into more of an equilibrium, the way we have in Ukraine. Again, a lot of this comes down to the specific scenario, the objectives, and the politics involved. You can build scenarios where what I just described doesn't happen, and it may not even be the most likely outcome. But the basic point here is that conflicts can begin with a surge of activity as both sides use up the resources that they prepared pre-war and then fall back to the level that they're able to actually sustain. And while NATO countries are arguably short in a lot of areas, They still have a truly enormous amount of stuff that could potentially be thrown at the wall in a crisis. Okay, so moving away from Ukraine specifically, there are a lot of questions relating to defence economics more broadly. Again, I wasn't able to address all of them, but I picked a couple out for us to go through. The first one was, how has the European defence industrial base changed since February 2022? And I'll give a much more in-depth answer to this eventually, but I think the very high-level observation is that generally the sector has been trying to adapt to the new circumstances, doing things like scaling up production capacity, for example, but it has been generally slow going. I also think that while some things have changed, like an appreciation that you do need mass and a lot of supply of certain basic resources like artillery ammunition, for example, there are still some things that might not have changed enough. Think things like the product mix and philosophy between buying a few very, very good things and a lot of okay things. There's still a long way to go in terms of integrating planning and strategy within the European Union. Still questions over how well integrated programs and industrial strategy are. That is, you might still have situations where countries say, our military says they need 300 of this kind of vehicle, so let's stand up a program to select and buy 300. Whereas I'd argue in some cases they'd be better served with a strategy, not a program. You know that you're probably going to want them, you know that others are probably going to want them, so maybe you come up with a joint strategy on how you're going to maintain the capability to design and build those vehicles. Maybe even if the military only wants 300, it's more efficient to stand up an industrial capacity to build 600 or 700 over a longer period of time and find buyers for that excess capacity. Because one thing you could say that parts of the European defence industry really haven't solved is the question of scale. You still have lots of small buys of bespoke products over small timelines that don't really justify or support industrial investment. And so along with things like changes to regulations and policy at both the national and European Union level, parts of the sector are still going to have serious challenges compared to the likes of US, Russian or Chinese producers. That said, there are a lot of good news stories out there. French self-propelled gun production is up several times over. Rheinmetall has led a number of expansions across their portfolio, and supported by some truly massive deals like an €8.5 billion contract with the Bundeswehr, Rheinmetall is building entirely new facilities like one for artillery ammo in Lower Saxony. The goal is reportedly for this one firm to be able to produce about 1.1 million 155mm shells per year by 2027, and they're already most of the way there. They've also set up facilities in Ukraine itself and announced the intention to do more in that direction, which might go some way towards explaining why there was reportedly a Russian assassination plot against the CEO of Rheinmetall that was foiled by US and German intelligence. There have also been an enormous number of smaller players that have really stepped up to the plate in Europe, from repair facilities to factories producing motors for drones, to old Warsaw Pact-era factories that in some cases have had to be reactivated in order to supply, for example, Soviet-caliber ammunition to keep Ukraine's artillery firing. And these stories, like Romania rebooting production at an ammunition factory that had been shuttered for 15 years in order to start turning out 152mm again, really help leads into the next question, which is, as a general rule, what's actually involved in restarting production after a military line has gone cold? One day we might have to talk about rearmament 101 as more of its own topic. But if you want a general overview of what it takes to restart production, it really depends on what state the line is in. In an emergency, one of the easiest things to bring online is going to be what's called slack capacity. This is where you already have all of the capital equipment, most of the people you're going to need who have the critical skills, but you're not running the line anywhere near its capacity. Maybe you're running the line 3 to 4 days a week and paying people for less than full-time hours. And while that might not be the most efficient way to run things in peacetime, it does allow you to do what the Russians have been able to do in many cases. If there's an emergency, just hire some extra people and switch over to a 7-day triple shift arrangement. Harder than that is when you have a production line that's in, you could say, cold storage or one that's convertible. This is a situation where you may not have the original workforce anymore, but you probably either still have the equipment in a warehouse somewhere, or you do have that equipment, but it's being used to produce something else instead, maybe a civilian product. Depending on what you're making, a lot of the stuff you might find in a factory is going to be multi-purpose. I know a bloke who once won a metal lathe in a card game that had been used by the Germans for war production during World War II, which he then started using to produce stuff for around the house and his neighbours. And shockingly enough, those requests didn't tend to be for military equipment. The easiest way to reactivate in this scenario is to pull that equipment out of storage or cancel whatever's being done on it and make it available for military production again. In a lot of the cases we're talking about here, at least the equipment had been mothballed. And then ideally, you probably want to find some of the original workforce to teach a new workforce how to do this. And in that respect, a lot of these businesses are arguably quite lucky the crisis happened in 2022 as opposed to 2027 or 2032. because Raytheon was able to find a bunch of retirees who remembered how to make stingers and bring them back on board. Similarly, some of the people working at many of these European munition facilities are original workers from before the factories started to shut down. The longer you wait, the less likely it is you're going to have a bunch of retirees around willing to teach your Gen Z employees how to build it like they used to, which leads into the most difficult and expensive situations, where you don't have the equipment or tooling anymore, and you can't easily reconstitute the workforce. In this case, depending on the product and how desperately you need it, you're probably screwed. In many cases, it's going to be cheaper to either re-engineer the original product from the ground up using new production techniques and new technology, or design an entirely new one and build that instead. I'd note that even if you do have the tooling and storage, it's possible the rest of the supply chain may have melted away. So it could be possible that you have a fairly dead production line, even if you think you've mothballed it, which might make restarting production, especially of complex systems, doable, but not necessarily economical. The next set of questions that I think go together relate to China and drones. The first question is essentially that given that China dominates the global drone market, would we expect that to translate into the Chinese military having access to lots and lots of drones, or are there potential constraints there, like the number of trained operators? And then there's the second part of the question, which is whether or not we expect the restrictions on top-tier chip-making equipment or advanced chips being sent from European and American states into China to meaningfully impact China's ability to militarize small drones. To the first part, I don't anticipate the PLA being short on drone operators if that's what they choose to prioritize. And if they do ever end up being short, I suspect it'll only be because of the insane number of drones that China produces. We're talking about a world where a single Chinese company, DJI, controls a majority of the civilian small drone market globally. And if Ukraine is capable of building up to produce potentially millions of small militarized drones per annum, I'd suggest a national priority level effort by Beijing would produce a heck of a lot more than that. At the same time, it's generally understood that China, along with various countries and companies around the world, are investing a lot of research in military swarming technology, so you can have a single operator or a small group of operators controlling very large swarms of drones. At that point, you don't need a one operator per FPV relationship, and your rate of fire is no longer anywhere near as constrained. So I think it needs to be anticipated that in the future, you're going to have a lot of drone operators out there capable of firing salvos of the things. Whether that be a lone operator at the platoon level controlling 4 to 12, for example, or a higher level system directing hundreds or thousands. Ultimately, it might just come down to requirements and investment. What do they decide they need in the force, and as a result, what do they fund? And as for the second part of the question, restrictions on chips and chip-making equipment impacting drone development, not really. Where those restrictions are really targeted is at the high end, the best chips and the equipment to make them. When it comes to other stuff, China is entirely capable of producing its own. And here's the thing, the kinds of drones we're seeing be so effective in Ukraine, or even potentially slightly larger, longer-ranged, more expensive versions that might be suitable for operations over longer distances, somewhere like the Asia-Pacific, they don't really need the best of the best. And you can kind of get that based on just the cost profile involved. If you're watching this on a computer, there's a decent chance your graphics card costs more than some FPV designs. What we've seen for some time now is a movement towards very cheap, miniaturized compute. Based on what we've seen in Ukraine, you can very much run a basic autonomous targeting system using a module that might only cost you, what, $100, $200? But you go back 20 years and the situation would have been very, very different. This is another reason why I get so put off when some commentators dismiss certain militaries by saying they're a certain number of years behind technologically. If purely hypothetically, for example, someone claimed that Russia was 10 to 15 years behind in submarine technology, or that China was 10 years behind when it came to high-end chip manufacturing, I'm sorry for anyone in the audience this hurts, but 10 years ago is 2015, not 1985. And if you think technology from 10, 15 or 30 years ago can't be dangerous, you're welcome to try your luck against a US submarine from 2015 and F-22 Raptor from 2010, or heck, square up against the version of the US military that went into Desert Storm in 1991. Tech levels, for lack of a better word, aren't magic. They don't give you a combat power advantage all by themselves. What they do is enable and improve capabilities. And for some capabilities and systems, older technology might be more than enough. Moving on, there are a couple of questions related to military logistics, but in the end, for time reasons, there could only be one. But hopefully, you'll all be happy with the one I chose to put at the top of the podium. Quote, are there any historic instances of extremely good or poor logistics that you find interesting? The answer, of course, is yes, and because everyone loves a story about a good old-fashioned logistical cataclysm, let me take you back to the 18th century, the British Royal Navy, the so-called War of Jenkins' Ear, which I'm sure made it onto everyone's school curriculums, and within it, the Battle of Cartagena. To spare you the full backstory on continental and colonial struggles in the 18th century between Britain and Spain, here's some spark notes. The year is 1731. Britain and Spain are both major powers with significant holdings in the Americas. A British trading ship, the Rebecca, is boarded by a Spanish Coast Guard ship on suspicion of smuggling, and while the exact details are disputed, in the process the captain of the British ship, Robert Jenkins, apparently has his ear cut off by one of the Spaniards. Because while police brutality may be timeless, the 18th century version did tend to include more swords. Jenkins proceeded to address his grievances to the king and government, who promptly did basically nothing. Because the War of Jenkins' Ear didn't start in the year that his ear was removed, it started 8 years later. The opposition picked up the Jenkins issue in Parliament, but most historians generally accept the war was over more conventional issues like domestic politics, trade, and the control of dirt, specifically in the Americas, rather than Britain being so incensed by the loss of a single gentleman's ear that they decided to start a major war over it. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the focus of the war was in the Caribbean, the British tried to seize a number of key Spanish ports in the region, with the focus of the campaign we're discussing today being the city of Cartagena in modern-day Colombia. That is where the background ends and the terrible logistics begin. Just for a bit of fun, in this section I'm going to be drawing pretty heavily on a rather old source, A History of the British Army written by J. Fortescue in 1899, because as a late 19th century historian, he has a certain way of phrasing things that tends to stray a bit from what you'd expect to see in modern academia. First off, the British decided to launch this transatlantic expedition in the middle of one of the largest typhus outbreaks in Royal Navy history. It got so bad that the Royal Navy was struggling to recruit new personnel faster than it was losing them to disease. Between August 1739 and October 1740, reportedly around 25,000 men fell so ill they had to be sent to hospitals or hospital ships. 2,570 of them died, and a further 1,965 of the survivors, now having experienced the Royal Navy's healthcare plan firsthand, decided they were better off risking the death penalty than going back, and deserted. The task force that was going to be sailing for the Americas did not dodge the typhus bullet. Of the men that left Britain, about 7% would die before they ever made it to the Americas, and a further 17% of the force would be put on the sick list. But before that could even happen, there were a couple of logistics and planning stuff-ups to go through. For example, some of the forces assigned to the task force were badly depleted or populated with recruits in poor health, probably not a good match for deployment to a tropical climate. For instance, the War Office had stripped down some of the Army's line units in order to make up new Marine units, only to then take some of those stripped-down line units and deploy them onto the task force. As one source put it, Lord Cathcart, who had been selected for the chief command, was vigilant, and indeed he had good cause, for the ignorance and stupidity of the authorities with whom he had to deal was almost incredible. Cathcart, bound as he knew to a deadly climate in the heart of the tropics, found that part of the force allocated to him consisted of boys who had not enough strength to handle their arms. End quote. At one point, the general discovered that the admiral commanding the escorts that were meant to protect his transports on the way to the Caribbean hadn't actually been given orders to sail, nor were the escorts even manned at that point. And then there were repeated delays, partly as a result of weather, which caused weeks and weeks of time to slip away. But despite all the delays, it seems no one thought to actually resupply the ships, meaning that before they'd even really gotten started, they'd burned through a lot of the expedition's supplies. Quote, "The men had been cooped up in the transports for 6 weeks and had consumed most of the victuals intended for the voyage. Sickness was seriously prevalent, and there had already been 60 deaths. Surely, wrote the general, some fresh meat might be given to the troops, but the authorities had given no thought to such matters." End quote. Then, as things were finally coming together, news arrived that a French fleet was now on the move, which, despite that being a very foreseeable event, no one appears to have foreseen, leading to even more delays. Quote, "So the days dragged on, the transports waited, and men died. Cathcart's patience was strained almost beyond endurance, and apart from the trouble with the army and the fleet, an endless shower of vexations poured upon him from Whitehall. His instructions were constantly altered, and no effort was made to keep his destination unknown. One statement, which was communicated to him as an important secret, had been the talk of all the coffee houses in Portsmouth long before it reached him. The newspapers published details of every shipload of arms and stores that would be sent to the West Indies, and as a climax, they printed a full proclamation, which had been prepared for Cathcart to issue on his arrival in South America. So you have an expedition that has no supplies, a constantly changing plan, absolutely zero in the way of secrecy, that set off with a depleted combat strength that was growing weaker by the day as a result of poor provisions and disease. And yet, I promise, it was about to get worse. Because you see, once they got to Jamaica, the British component of the force got to rendezvous with the smaller American component. By the time they met up with the British, the commander of the American troops had already died of disease, And apparently the Americans themselves were in even worse shape than the Brits, having buried scores of their men before disembarking. One historian described the American troops as guiltless of drill or discipline, and described their arrival in Jamaica as disorderly and mutinous, but at the same time, he noted a good logistical reason for it. Quote, "There was good excuse for their discontent, for the English government, though it had made arrangements for the payment and victualling, so feeding, the British troops, had made none whatsoever for the Americans." So, yes, the British government had factored the Americans into their battle plans, but apparently expected them to subsist on nothing more than dirt and love for king and country. If you're wondering how Lord Cathcart, the bloke who was trying to hold this whole expedition together, responded on discovering that his Americans were starving, sick and mutinous, you might be surprised to hear he didn't react at all, because he'd gotten the full Oregon Trail experience and died of dysentery before the fleet even got to Jamaica. General Spotswood, who would have been Cathcart's second in command, had also died of disease, and so command of the British ground component went to Wentworth, who reportedly didn't have much in the way of combat command experience. All of that said, by the time the force finally reached its objective and set about trying to siege the Spanish, they still, for everything, enjoyed a massive numerical and firepower advantage over their Spanish opponents. But superior numbers and firepower are no match for terrible command decisions, terrible logistics, and poor planning. For example, despite the goal of this campaign being to siege down Spanish positions, when the British went to siege Fort St. Louis, it was discovered that, quote, "There was but one engineer in the whole army who was at least competent to carry on a siege, and there appears to have been difficulty in getting him to the scene of the action at all, and secondly, in making him work once he reached it," end quote. As a result, the force disembarked on the 22nd of March, but ground wasn't broken on the gun positions until the 23rd. Then, once the gun positions were completed, it was discovered the army had brought so few effective artillerymen that the Navy had to provide the gunners too. Remember, the force landed on the 22nd of March, but the first round from the cannons wasn't fired until the 2nd of April. Then, once the cannon battle between the fort and the British gunners began, another discovery was made about an interesting planning decision. Now, even by the 18th century, history had provided plenty of guidance, rules and maxims about where you might place a major military camp. Don't put it in a disease-ridden swamp, or everyone will die. Don't set up somewhere overly exposed to enemy attack, because then everyone might die. But I'm not sure if anyone had felt the need to actually write down a rule saying thou shalt not put your camp in a position so exposed to enemy artillery that they will probably be able to hit you by mistake. And yet, apparently here some genius decided to prove that the apparently obvious sometimes ain't so. Quote, "Then it was discovered that by some mistake, the camp had been pitched directly in the same line with the artillery battery, so that every shot from the fort that flew over the British guns fell among the tents, killing and wounding over 100 men on the first day." Now, apparently after all that, the Royal Navy seems to have said screw it, fired on the fort with their ships, silenced its guns, and in a subsequent assault, the fort was taken at the cost of 2 British wounded. But by that point, 130 men had been killed or wounded in combat, 250 had died from disease, and over 600 were in hospital. Because that's what happens when you take your time with a poorly provisioned force in that kind of environment. We're still pretty much at the start of the story, but in the interest of time, I'm going to assume that by this point, you probably get the idea. The rest of the operations were generally a disaster, the lone siege engineer apparently died, and the rest of the operation basically followed that brand of luck. The British managed to launch a campaign with a massive numerical and firepower advantage, and through abysmal planning, terrible logistics and awful execution, managed to achieve basically nothing, unless you count perhaps losing very roughly 2/3 of the force, killed or wounded as an achievement, with some of the units that originally embarked reportedly suffering 90% fatalities. The Spanish Admiral de Lazo got a statue, presumably both for his competence and also not interrupting his enemy when they were making a series of mistakes. The British force got a very bloody nose, and future lecturers got a fantastic example of what not to do. Suffice to say, a very special military operation all round. Although, unfortunately, whether or not the British flagship decided to fly a massive mission accomplished banner on the way back to the British Isles is a question unfortunately lost to history. Okay, so moving on from the stuff of substance, we had a couple of questions that were more focused on the channel or just generally fun. Firstly, how does the process work, and how long does it take on a weekly basis? In terms of time, I haven't really taken weekends since early 2022. The channel takes up a good chunk of time, and there's also things like consulting, conference appearances and talks that fills in a lot of the rest. But in large part, thanks to the patrons and all of you, I can give the channel the lion's share. The process for the videos themselves basically runs in 4 stages. You have a whole bunch of topics at any given time that I'm passively monitoring. When information comes up, I'm collecting it, putting it away, and then once I think I have enough material for an episode, or it's topical at that point, I move into active gathering. And there's a couple of episodes in that stage at any given time. At that point, I'm actively going out and chasing data to fill in the gaps, so that I'm sure I have a thesis, I can defend it, there's enough material there for an episode. Depending on the topic, there's a wide array of experts I can potentially consult, from combat engineers to fighter pilots to people all across the defence industrial base, and their assistance has often been incredibly helpful. But for the most part, the process has to be tight because the team is so small. There's the bloke who does the subtitles, my long-suffering sound guy, and for everything else, there's me. Then one episode each week is obviously picked for production. The slides come first because they de facto function as a script. There is no separate script of every word that I'm going to say. I just work off the slides as I would in a normal presentation, which obviously makes life significantly harder for the absolute legend who generates the subtitles for my episodes after they're finished. But in any case, the slides do come first, and then once that's done, it's recorded and goes through editing and finishing. Depending on their content and complexity, different episodes can take a very different amount of time to complete, which is why it makes sense to be working on multiple episodes at one time. Because if you're going to need to do a bunch of research on things, go back and forth with experts or sources in order to clarify points, potentially commission imagery, that sort of thing, you're not going to be able to fill all of that in 1 week. So instead I run multiple episodes in parallel, so there's always one close enough to the finish line that you can make it ready for that Sunday release, at least under ideal circumstances. Then there was a bunch of questions that focused on how the channel crosses over with the more professional side. Do people at work know about it? Do clients know about it? Has it impacted employment opportunities? Do I have any misgivings or worries? To answer that, yes, every boss I've had since early 2022 knew about the channel. As a general rule, if you're interested in the defense sector, I'd strongly advise against trying to hide things from your employers. And also, yes, I do think views of the whole YouTube thing do vary person to person, but a lot of people I've interacted with or worked with have been very supportive. And there have also been a range of opportunities, none of which I'll talk about, which have kind of flown from that. As for misgivings and worries, it's mostly been okay. The vast majority of the hate mail doesn't really put me off. In fact, it's often kind of entertaining. I think a recent classic was an email where the entire content was just a subject line reading something like, "You have an awful, gratingly annoying accent," which kind of made me feel fantastic, to be honest, because if my accent is terrible, the implication must be that people are watching for the content, not the quality of the voiceover. I do have to deal with a lot of things like phishing attacks and scams, I'd guess literally hundreds since 2022, which I think just comes with the territory. Next up in the questions was, can you tell us anything about who is watching? Are any Russians engaging with the channel? And indeed, thanks to the wonders of YouTube analytics, I can actually tell you a lot about who's watching. Compared to the overall YouTube audience, Perun very much skews older. Comparatively fewer 18 to 24-year-olds, although there are still a significant number of you out there, and then overrepresentation when you get over 25, and especially when you get over 35. Incredibly enough, the viewers on a defense economics channel do skew somewhat male. Cities and states with a heavy military presence do tend to be overrepresented, and while about a third of viewers are from the United States and roughly 9% from the UK, from there you start to see a lot more of Europe pop up on the list. There are more viewers from Germany than Canada or Australia, for example, although that does make sense when you account for the differing population levels, but what population alone really doesn't explain is what I see coming out of Scandinavia and the Baltics. Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Norway, they're all in the top 10. And those countries, as well as places like Estonia, kind of thrash most of the AUKUS countries when it comes to views per unit population. So trust me, I do understand and really appreciate how international this channel is, even if I do lapse into the occasional Australianism. In terms of regular Russian viewers, that's hard, because you imagine a lot of them would be concealing where they're browsing from. But as far as I can tell, there are a couple of thousand who watch regularly, and some of those have reached out and provided submissions or information to the channel even. But perhaps unsurprisingly, at least in the data that YouTube gives me, they are soundly outnumbered by Ukrainians. Some hopefully quicker ones now. If I didn't have access to PowerPoint, what software would I use instead? Well, I don't exactly have the talent for sock puppets, mate, so it'd probably be some other sort of presentation software. Across different roles, I've worked with a bunch of stuff. PowerPoint's just what I know works. Then there's a chicken and egg question. What came first, your interest in defense and economics, or games focused on defense and economics? And the honest answer is I don't really know. And I say that because I got my first serious books about military history at about the same time I got Civilization 2 as a kid. The best answer might be that it was probably inevitable, but I find it funnier to blame the Civilopedia. I think the basic gist of it is I was always keen to understand why things are the way they are, and before that, why they were the way they were. And that kind of leads you into picking up some economics, some history, some sciences, and then given its monstrously large role in human history, warfare. Which brings us to our final category, gaming, fun stuff, and everyone's favourite, miscellaneous. Question 1. Who would win, an Australian emu or a Canadian goose? The correct answer you're looking for, mate, is cassowary. Those things are bloody vicious. But if you want to pick from just those two, the emus are sadistic, they got the height advantage, and unlike the geese, the emu army actually has combat experience against a peer, or at least near-peer regular human army. If they can handle a Maxim gun technical, I reckon they can handle this. Next up, what do you read when you're not reading defence industry reports? I don't understand the question. What do you mean other than defence industry reports? More serious answer, I don't have as much time to read as I would like, otherwise Perun Gaming would probably be getting some more regular content. But to give you a sense, the most recent one I finished off was called My 4 Years in Germany. It was written by an American, James W. Gerard, who was the US ambassador to the German Imperial Court before the beginning of World War I. And while yes, obviously it's written from a very specific perspective, that for me is kind of the value. It's about German politics, German social dynamics, and Prussian militarism through some very American eyes. So if you can get your hands on a copy, absolutely an interesting read. And perhaps in the context of more recent wars, it's really interesting reading the foreword to this. Remember, it's being written in 1917, before Germany has been defeated. The ambassador says, quote, "I want to bring home to our people the gravity of the situation, because I want to tell them the military and naval power of the German Empire is unbroken." He then gives a number of figures on the German military in 1917 and goes on. "I state these figures because Americans do not grasp either the magnitude or the importance of this war. The 9 million men and more, for at least 400,000 come of military age in Germany every year, because of their experiences in 2.5 years of war, are better and more efficient soldiers than at the time when they were first called to the colours. Their officers know far more of the science of this war, and the men themselves now have the skill and bearing of veterans. Nor should anyone believe that Germany will break under starvation or make peace because of resolutions. The German nation is not one which makes revolutions. There will be scattered riots in Germany, but no simultaneous rising of the whole people. The officers of the army are all of one class, and a class devoted to the ideals of autocracy. A revolution of the army is impossible, and at home there are only boys and old men, easily kept in subjugation by the police." He also said that there is a far greater danger of starvation to our allies than the Germans, and he also minimises the potential impact of sanctions and finances. Owing to the clever financial handling of the country by the government and the great banks, there is at present no financial distress in Germany. We are engaged in a war against the greatest military power the world has ever seen." End quote. Of course, in hindsight, we know that economics did matter, that Germany would starve, and for better and worse, it would very much become a country that makes revolutions. But apparently from the outside looking in, autocracies being able to project the image of strength, even when they were testing the limits of their resources, may not exactly be a recent phenomenon. Next, surprisingly upvoted, flightless bird question, Perun, do you think you'd be able to defeat an ostrich in hand-to-hand combat? I suspect the answer is yes, but I suspect it would be a fairly chaotic spectacle for the grand total of 3 people that tuned in to watch it. Next up, we have a bunch of gaming questions. Starting with, do you plan on playing logistical or factory builder games such as Satisfactory, Factorio, etc. on the gaming channel? I'm not sure it'll ever make it to the gaming channel, but I have played Satisfactory. That's actually my not particularly efficiently designed, but zero-waste nuclear power plant on the right there. I tend to find those kind of games a bit chill though, so perhaps not the first pick from an audience perspective. Next question was, what was your favourite faction in Warhammer 40,000? And if you watched the previous Q&A episode, you'll know that when I did play 40k, I played a mechanised Eldar army. Perhaps because younger me was allergic to the idea of anyone I was playing against having any fun. You use speed, hide behind terrain, avoid getting hit, refuse to slug it out, and then play the objectives. But my favourite faction had to be Guard, especially artillery-centric Guard, because at that point, half the game is figuring out how to prioritise targets to blap with your artillery each turn, and I just found that kind of satisfying, even if the win rate wasn't as high. Then a pair of similar questions for a different fictional universe. Now we're talking about Battletech, with question 1 being favourite faction and question 2 being favourite mech. I know I'm going to win no shortage of enemies with both of these choices, but here we go. For faction, I'm going to tell the Great Houses and the clans to both take a hike and go for the Taurian Concordat. For those of you who don't know the universe, they're basically a small independent power off to the periphery of all the great power conflicts, and they're characterised by a functioning democracy, checks and balances, rights and freedoms, a generally free economy with good working conditions and protections, but they're also a middle power with a deep-seated society-wide determination and a proven historical record of fanatically defending themselves and wrecking the absolute face of any imperial power that tries to take away their independence. Is there a serious slice of propaganda pitch in there? Absolutely, but there's a lot of truth in there too. So for the moment, I'm happy to stand by that pick. But the one I suspect will get people really worked up is the question about my favourite battle mech. Because after all, a significant part of the reason the fictional universe exists is to justify combat between giant manned combat walkers, battle mechs. But when I used to play a Battletech Mercenaries campaign back in the day, our unit didn't run any mechs. And honestly, looking at what they tend to offer compared to what they cost, I generally don't like a lot of them. We generally rejected them as a bit bling and instead decided to go for some basics. We were given enough in-game currency to buy ourselves 4 mechs, which in the universe is a standard tactical unit called a lance. Being a bunch of smartasses with a spreadsheet though, we instead cleaved a little too close to modern doctrine and set ourselves up a small combined arms force. Even according to the rules in a game about giant stompy robots, if you take enough money to buy 4 giant stompy robots, it turns out you can actually buy yourself a couple of tanks or self-propelled guns, some missile carriers, some artillery, some basic ISR assets, a small infantry force, and some vehicles to mechanise that infantry. Having a couple of infantry available in particular was a huge boon. During downtime, they can guard your stuff, back you up in a bar fight, make a little extra money training local units, and when you do get into combat, not only do they make excellent screening assets that are usually relatively cheap and easy to replace should anything ever go wrong, if you are working alongside some very craptastic local units, well, just attach a couple of your blokes with communications gear to the local units, and then argue with whoever's running the game that they should be allowed to call in fire now. Vehicles are generally going to be cheaper to buy, easier to maintain. If they are damaged, you're probably going to have better luck repairing a diesel engine rather than finding a spare fusion engine in the middle of nowhere. Oh, and instead of having a dropship that can carry 4 mechs and 2 aerospace fighters, the Leopard, you can instead go with a Gazelle, which can carry 15 heavy vehicles. Enough for a tank platoon, small artillery battery, some mechanised infantry, some missile carriers, and still some room for salvage left over. Is it the perfect combination on the table? Absolutely not. But was it funny, cheap, and logistically simple? Absolutely. Then moving away from gaming to another question that got a rather large number of upvotes. Perun, if you had to create a cocktail called the Thunder Run to Moscow, what would you put in it? My initial joking answer, which is absolutely a joke for liability and safety reasons, is that you start with a Moscow Mule, which is traditionally served after all in a copper mug, and then you add the Thunder Run part by attaching a small device that gives an electrical shock to whoever tries to pick it up to drink it. The more serious answer is you start to make a Moscow Mule as normal, and then when you get about 2/3 of the way through the process, you actually give up, stop, turn around, and start thinking about maybe booking a flight somewhere. And then finally, to get a bit serious again before we close out, someone had to go and ask this one. I'm paraphrasing, but the question is basically a bunch of people watch your channel, and they have been for some time now. How does that feel? And the big thing to say is just that it's incredibly humbling, and that I feel and understand that there is a lot of responsibility that goes with that. I know there are a lot of very learned, valuable voices out there that never get this kind of platform. I also know there are a lot of people who are given this kind of platform and let it go to their heads. And so my big goal really is to respect the heck out of what the algorithm and all of you have given me. I want to make sure the information is as good as I can make it, that the caveats are there, that every episode brings something new and potentially valuable to the table, and that through all that, even when we make jokes, even when we're very clinical about talking through subjects like war and defence economics, that the human side of it never falls too far by the wayside. I think it's useful to talk about the war in Ukraine, for example, in a very analytical way, but at the same time always remembering that behind the study, behind the story, are real people with real lives who are often paying an enormous price to try and shape how that story ends. And on that note, I think we can wind up. For the channel update, I want to make this short and sweet. I've been promising I'd get to this Q&A episode for months at this point, but I do hope, having finally done it, that I was able to cover a lot of valuable ground and that you got a lot out of the episode. Obviously, there were more than enough questions provided to fill more than one episode, but I think I'll give it a couple of months before I try and work my way further down the list. That said, thank you very much to all of you who submitted your questions, and if you didn't see yours in the episode today, keep in mind it may be because I intend to answer it as part of a full normal episode in the coming weeks. As for upcoming episodes, you may have noticed there have been some significant international developments in recent days and weeks, and so next week we will be pivoting to Europe to unpack part of that story. My voice is also mostly back at this point, so hopefully I should be able to start catching up on some backlogged activities. Thank you very much once again to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement, and I do hope to see you all again next week.